Conversely, Kenyatta's critics highlight the other side of that coin. They argue that his style of governance was dictatorial and inclined toward nepotism. Detractors note that freedom of expression and political pluralism were early casualties under Kenyatta. The seeds of one-party authoritarianism were planted on his watch. They point out that while Kenyatta spoke passionately against the injustices of colonial rule, in power he presided over continuities with colonialism. A small elite, now African and often Kikuyu like himself, controlled wealth and land, while the poor black majority saw relatively little change in their economic plight. To these critics, Kenyatta's rule was neo-colonial, in that it left intact many inequities of colonial Kenya, merely swapping white rulers for black. Nowhere is this more evident than in the fate of the Mau Mau veterans. As the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission later reported, President Kenyatta used his power to allocate large tracts of former colonial land to himself and his family, while many Mau Mau fighters and their families remained dispossessed and voiceless. The sacrifice of the forest fighters was not officially honored in Kenyatta's time. In fact, public memory of Mau Mau was suppressed for over 40 years after independence. It was not until 2003 that the ban on Mau Mau was finally lifted by a later government, allowing Kenya to openly acknowledge that chapter of its history. History's verdict on Jomo Kenyatta thus remains layered with irony and nuance. Here was a man who started as a radical young firebrand, writing to the Times for land rights, yet as president accumulated vast lands for his own lineage. A leader who suffered injustice in a colonial court, yet in power was slow to reform an unjust system at home. A freedom fighter by reputation who pragmatically sidelined the very militants who fought for freedom. Kenyatta was, in many ways, a bridge between eras, able to don a Kikuyu elder's leopard skin cap in one moment and a Western business suit in another. He opened Kenya to the world and steered a careful course, but also left deep issues unresolved. Today, Kenyatta's name graces monuments, highways, even the country's largest airport. His portrait still hangs in public offices. He is remembered with a mix of awe and ambivalence, a liberator to some, a disappointment to others. Yet without question, his life's journey, from a peasant's hut to a prison cell to the presidential palace, mirrors the wider saga of Africa's 20th century quest for self-determination. Jomo Kenyatta's story is the story of Kenya, full of drama, contradiction, heartbreak and hope, in a softened tone. As we conclude, we reflect on Kenyatta's own words at independence. Let us unite, let us forgive those who trespass against us, and let us move forward. In forging a nation, Kenyatta chose unity over vengeance, a choice that brought peace, but at a cost we are still examining. His legacy invites us to ask, what is the price of peace, and whose stories get silenced in the name of moving on? In August 1952, a tall, charismatic Kenyan stood before a crowd of 30,000 and thundered, "Mau Mau has spoiled the country. Let Mau Mau perish forever. All people should search for Mau Mau and kill it." The man's name was Jomo Kenyatta, and despite his public denouncement of the violent uprising, within months British colonial authorities would arrest him as the alleged mastermind behind the very Mau Mau revolt he condemned. It was a dramatic twist of irony, one that marked the rise of a leader who would become Kenya's first president, yet carry a complex legacy. For the next 20 minutes, we journey through the life of Jomo Kenyatta, from his humble beginnings and overseas activism through persecution and triumph to the contradictions of his rule. This is a story of resilience and revolution, of a founding father celebrated and a freedom struggle partly forgotten. Jomo Kenyatta was born Kamawa Nengi around 1894 in the highlands of British East Africa, today Kenya. He was the son of farmers from the Kikuyu people, raised in a traditional community near the foothills of Mount Kenya. As a boy, Kamau's life took an unexpected turn when he suffered a serious affliction, jigger infestations in his feet, and sought treatment at a newly established Church of Scotland mission hospital. There, surrounded by strange European customs and Christian teachings, young Kamau glimpsed a wider world. Fascinated, he ran away from home to join the mission school as a resident pupil, paying his fees by working as a houseboy and cook for a European settler. In 1914, he was baptized with the name Johnstone Kamau, symbolically linking him to the Western faith and education system. This transformation was profound. Johnstone Kamau became one of the first Kikuyu youths to step out of the strict confines of village life into the cosmopolitan world of colonial Nairobi. In the bustling city, he secured a job as a clerk in the public works department and soon adopted the surname Kenyatta, inspired by a fancy beaded belt, a Kenyatta in Kikuyu, that he often wore. Thus, Kamau evolved into Johnstone Kenyatta, a young African man adept at navigating both traditional Kikuyu culture and the colonial urban environment. By the early 1920s, Kenyatta's life as a civil servant and interpreter exposed him to the inequalities of colonial rule. He married his first wife, Grace Wahu, in 1919 and began raising a family. But around him, Kenya's indigenous peoples were chafing under oppressive laws. In 1921, an ex-postal clerk named Harry Thuku led one of Kenya's first political protest movements, the East Africa Association, agitating against the seizure of African lands and the Kipande pass laws imposed on Africans. Kenyatta joined this nascent resistance, eager to speak for his people. When the colonial government banned Thuku's organization, its members regrouped in 1925 as the Kikuyu Central Association, KCA. Kenyatta's dedication caught their attention. By 1928, he became the KCA's General Secretary, leaving his comfortable municipal job to devote himself full-time to the struggle for African rights. Determined to unify and educate his community, the young Kenyatta also founded a Kikuyu-language newspaper that same year. He called it Mwigathania, He Who Brings Together, a monthly journal promoting self-improvement and unity among the Kikuyu. Its tone was moderate, even cautiously respectful of colonial authorities, yet it carried the hopes of a people beginning to find their voice. Little did Kenyatta know that this journey of advocacy would soon carry him far beyond Kenya's shores, to the heart of the British Empire itself. By 1929, Kenyatta had emerged as a prominent spokesman for Kenyan Africans. That year, the British proposed to unify Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika into a federation, a plan deeply feared by the Kikuyu, who saw it as a scheme to entrench white settler dominance at the expense of indigenous land rights. The Kikuyu Central Association chose Kenyatta, with his fluent English and growing confidence, to travel to London and plead their case. So, in February 1929, Johnstone Kenyatta donned a Western suit and journeyed by sea to Britain, representing the grievances of his people on the world stage. In London, Kenyatta cut an impressive figure. articulate and passionate. When colonial officials refused to meet him, he took his cause to the media. In March 1930, he penned a bold letter to the Times of London, laying out 5 key demands of the KCA: return stolen lands to the Kikuyu, improve African education, abolish the burdensome hut tax on women, which forced many into destitution, allow African representation in government, and respect traditional customs. If these grievances were not addressed, Kenyatta warned in print, a dangerous explosion was inevitable, a prescient and subtle threat from a man advocating for justice. His eloquence helped stall the British plans for an East African federation, and he earned a reputation as a voice for the voiceless back home. Kenyatta would spend most of the next 17 years abroad, transforming himself into an international anti-colonial activist and intellectual. He testified in hearings like the Carter Land Commission in 1932, detailing how Kenyan farmers had been pushed into crowded reserves while white settlers enjoyed the fertile White Highlands. He also sought new allies in the global fight against imperialism. In the early 1930s, Kenyatta even traveled to the Soviet Union, spending 2 years at Moscow's Communist University of the Toilers of the East to study politics and revolutionary theory. Though his flirtation with communism was brief, it signaled his willingness to explore any ideology that promised freedom for oppressed peoples. After Moscow, Kenyatta made his way back to Britain, where he pursued formal studies in anthropology. Under the tutelage of the renowned anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski at the London School of Economics, Kenyatta immersed himself in learning about culture, his own culture, to be precise. He researched the customs and social structures of the Kikuyu, determined to show the world that African societies had rich, coherent systems of their own. In 1938, he published Facing Mount Kenya, an anthropological study of Kikuyu life that was part scholarly work, part impassioned defense of his people's dignity. In its pages, the former mission boy John Stone assumed a new, grander identity. He began calling himself Jomo Kenyatta, Jomo meaning burning spear in Kikuyu. The metamorphosis was complete. He had forged himself into a symbol of African pride and resistance. While living in Europe, Kenyatta also moved in influential circles of black intellectuals and activists. He briefly joined anti-imperialist groups and rubbed shoulders with West Indian Pan-Africanists like George Padmore, who became a close friend. Together with Padmore and others, Kenyatta embraced Pan-Africanism, the idea that Africans and the diaspora should unite against colonialism. During the Second World War, he was stuck in England. The war made it impossible to return to Kenya, so he survived by working as a farm labourer in Sussex and giving occasional lectures. Even as he toiled in the English countryside, he kept writing pamphlets to publicise the Kenyan cause. In October 1945, as the guns of W.R. Tafun fell silent, Jomo Kenyatta emerged to play a historic role on the global stage. He helped organise the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. There he sat shoulder to shoulder with fellow future leaders of independent Africa. W.E.B. Du Bois presided over the gathering, and a young Kwame Nkrumah of the Gold Coast, Ghana, was an eager participant. Together, they passed bold resolutions demanding an end to colonial rule across Africa. Kenyatta's voice, seasoned by years abroad, rang with authority as he spoke for Kenya's freedom. At European lecterns and African forums alike, he had become an ambassador of the Kenyan struggle. In 1946, after 15 long years away, Jomo Kenyatta finally returned home to Kenya. The country he found was on the brink of seismic change. World War II veterans and a new generation of educated Africans were increasingly impatient for independence. Kenyatta, now in his late 40s, stepped off the ship with considerable fame among his people, and also the suspicions of colonial authorities. Soon after his return, he took up a modest job as a school principal at the Githunguri Teachers College, where he taught farming and literacy, quietly continuing to uplift his community. But greater responsibilities were calling. By 1947, Kenyatta's stature in nationalist circles was unrivaled, and he was elected president of the Kenya African Union, KAU, the colony's foremost African political organization. KAU picked up where earlier groups like KCA left off, demanding independence and majority rule. As president of KAU, Kenyatta traveled widely across Kenya, addressing village meetings and town halls, urging unity among ethnic groups and a peaceful path to freedom. He assured all who listened that in an independent Kenya, all races, black, white, and Asian, would be protected and welcome. He preached hard work, national solidarity, and forswore resentment. But even as Kenyatta advocated gradualist, non-violent change, a very different kind of rebellion was brewing in the shadows. Between 1950 and 1952, Kenya plunged into the Mau Mau uprising, a violent insurgency led primarily by disaffected Kikuyu peasants and laborers. Frustrated by decades of land dispossession and broken promises, secret Kikuyu guerrilla groups began to attack colonial farms and collaborators, swearing oaths of unity and courage under the cover of dense forests. They called themselves the Land and Freedom Army, but to the British, they were simply Mau Mau, a name that soon struck terror. The conflict was brutal and complex, a war for independence, a civil war among Kenyans, and a colonial counterinsurgency all at once. By 1952, Mau Mau fighters had killed loyalist chiefs and a few dozen white settlers. In turn, the British colonial response would ultimately kill tens of thousands of Africans through executions, firefights, and the horrors of detention camps. Amid this spiraling violence, Kenyatta walked a tightrope. To many Mau Mau fighters in the forests, Kenyatta's name was sacred. They saw him as a hero of African nationalism and even invoked him in their oaths, despite having no direct contact with him. But Kenyatta himself was a moderate, and he knew that Mau Mau's violent tactics could undermine international support for Kenya's independence. So he took a public stand against the uprising. In April 1952, as attacks increased, Kenyatta embarked on a speaking tour across Kikuyu regions, passionately denouncing the Mau Mau. He pleaded that independence must be won through discipline and unity, not through the sword. At a massive rally in Kiambu in August 1952, he issued his famous, unequivocal condemnation. Mau Mau has spoiled the country. Let Mau Mau perish forever. It was a dramatic repudiation. All people should search for Mau Mau and kill it, he urged that day, distancing himself completely from the insurgents' cause. In the pre-dawn hours of October 20, 1952, as a state of emergency gripped Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta was arrested at his home by colonial police. The British had decided to cut off the head of the snake. Without warning, they swept up Kenyatta and 5 of his closest colleagues in KAU, a group that would become known as the Kapenguria Six. Kenyatta, along with Achieng Oneko, Bildad Kagia, Paul Nge, Fred Kubai, and Kungu Karumba, was flown in chains to a remote detention center in Kapenguria, near the Ugandan border. The location was deliberate. The authorities wanted to hold a trial far from the public eye, hoping to avoid turning the defendants into martyrs. When the trial of Regina vs. Kenyatta and others opened in late 1952, it quickly took on the aura of a political show trial. Kenyatta and the others were accused of masterminding the Mau Mau uprising, a charge for which the colonial government had scant direct evidence. In fact, the decision to prosecute Kenyatta had been made before any proof was found. Officials scoured his speeches and papers after arrest, desperate to pin something on him. The judge, Ransley Thacker, was a recently retired colonial judge handpicked for his presumed loyalty. He was even covertly paid $20,000 by the Kenya government as an incentive to take the case. The defense team, led by brilliant British lawyer D.N. Pritt, exposed glaring flaws in the prosecution. Their star witness, a former Mau Mau insider named Rawson Macharia, eventually admitted he had perjured himself, confessing in 1958 that his testimony against Kenyatta was false. The prosecution never produced any solid link between Kenyatta and Mau Mau's secret operations. It hardly mattered. After a lengthy, tense trial, Judge Thacker found Kenyatta and his co-defendants guilty in April 1953, declaring Kenyatta the prime mover behind Mau Mau. The verdict was almost universally understood as politically motivated, a rigged political trial with a predetermined outcome, as one historian later described it. Kenyatta, dignified and unbowed, told the court that he did not recognize the verdict, asserting that the colonial regime had made him a scapegoat to justify crushing KIU and Kenyan dissent. Indeed, in the aftermath, the colonial government banned the Kenya-African Union outright and shut down independent schools associated with nationalist leaders, including the very school where Kenyatta had taught. They even seized Kenyatta's property at Gatundu and demolished his family home, as if to blot out his presence. Kenyatta was sentenced to 7 years of hard labor, to be followed by indefinite restriction, essentially open-ended exile within Kenya. At age 50-something, his exact birth year was uncertain, he was dispatched to a remote prison in Lokitong, in the harsh northern frontier district. There, Kenyatta spent the mid-1950s breaking rocks under a punishing sun. Due to his age, he was at times excused from the heaviest labor. He served as the prison cook, dishing out meager rations of beans and posho, maize porridge, to fellow inmates. Among those jailed with him was a captured Mau Mau field commander, Waruhiu Itote, also known as General China. Kenyatta befriended Itote in prison and even gave him English lessons, an odd twist of fate, wherein the man accused of leading Mau Mau became the teacher of a man who actually had led Mau Mau fighters in the field. The prisoners formed cliques, Kenyatta and the pragmatic Itote on one side, more radical KIU detainees on the other, and at one point a fellow inmate even attempted to stab Kenyatta, though he survived unharmed. The years of confinement took a toll on Kenyatta's health. His wrists and ankles were scarred by manacles, his body afflicted with eczema. Yet his spirit remained unbroken. In fact, Kenyatta's imprisonment transformed him into a living legend. As word spread that he had been unjustly condemned, many Kenyans began to regard Kenyatta as a martyr for the cause of freedom. Across Africa, his name became synonymous with anti-colonial resistance. While he languished behind bars, calls for his release grew louder. The first local leader to demand Kenyatta's freedom was a Luo politician, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who recognized that Kenyatta's continued detention was an insult to African aspirations. International voices joined in. In 1955, a British sympathizer published The Trial of Jomo Kenyatta, casting doubt on the verdict. By the late 1950s, even global figures spoke out. India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru sent appeals. China's Zhou Enlai voiced support. President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, by then leading independent Africa's first former colony, personally pressed British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan to free Kenyatta. From Cairo to London, conferences of newly independent nations passed resolutions insisting on Kenyatta's release. The British colonial government dug in its heels, with Kenya's settler-dominated regime claiming that Kenyatta was the one man who must never rule Kenya, branding him the leader to darkness and death in one inflammatory speech. But the tide of history was turning. The newly freed Kenyatta wasted no time stepping back into political leadership. In 1961, he assumed the presidency of the Kenya African National Union, KANU, the leading nationalist party which had flatly refused to participate in any government without him. Kenyatta's return instantly galvanized the independence movement. Uhuru, Swahili for freedom, was on the horizon. Fittingly, Kenyatta named his newborn son Uhuru that year. Throughout 1962, Kenyatta engaged in delicate negotiations with British officials and with rival Kenyan leaders. he travelled to Lancaster House in London to hammer out a constitutional framework for a new Kenya. There he sparred and then compromised with representatives of the smaller ethnic groups, organised under the Kenya African Democratic Union, KADU. They feared domination by Kenyatta's alliance of Kikuyu and Luo, KANU, and thus pushed for a federal system, Majimboism, that would give regions autonomy. Kenyatta, eager for a strong unitary state, opposed this, but he also understood the art of the possible. He accepted a watered-down version of federalism, likely with a strategic wink, knowing he could later amend the constitution once in power. It was a pragmatic move that allayed fears and kept the independence train moving. Back in Kenya, Kenyatta embarked on a campaign to reassure the country's anxious white settler minority, whose economic prowess was still vital. At that time, Europeans controlled some 80% of Kenya's exports. Fearing a ruinous exodus of skilled settlers, Kenyatta publicly promised that no one would be victimized in independent Kenya. He pledged not to seize farms or expel white civil servants arbitrarily. "We don't want to chase away the whites," he would tell rallies, a stance that surprised some Mau Mau veterans but won the trust of many settlers. His efforts paid off. Several prominent white leaders even endorsed KANU in the 1963 elections. This spirit of reconciliation extended to personal relationships. Kenyatta shockingly befriended Malcolm MacDonald, the last British governor, who came to regard Kenyatta as the wisest and strongest, most popular potential prime minister for Kenya. The one-time prisoner and the colonial official formed an unlikely alliance that smoothed Kenya's path to freedom. MacDonald fast-tracked independence, believing delays would only breed radicalism. In May 1963, Kenya held its first fully democratic general election. Kenyatta's KANU party won by a landslide, securing 83 of 124 seats in the new legislature. On June 1, 1963, Jomo Kenyatta was sworn in as Prime Minister of the autonomous Kenyan government, with the British Queen still officially head of state for a transitional period. A new nation was taking shape under his leadership. During the final lead-up to independence, Kenyatta set the tone for Kenya's future. He urged all Kenyans to forgive past grievances and work as one. At rallies, he often proclaimed, "We cannot build a prosperous nation if we harbor ill feelings about the past." It became a guiding mantra of his government, a forgive and forget philosophy aimed at healing the wounds of colonialism by not dwelling on them. Independence Day arrived at midnight on December 12, 1963. As the new Kenyan flag rose under the night sky, Kenyatta stood before a jubilant crowd in a Nairobi stadium and declared it the greatest day in Kenya's history and the happiest day of my life. Beside him on the dais were not only foreign dignitaries, Britain's Duke of Edinburgh, formally handed over sovereignty, but also former Mau Mau fighters, whom Kenyatta had pointedly invited to the celebration. In a touching personal moment, he had even flown in his British second wife, Edna, and their son Peter from England for the festivities, uniting his far-flung family on Kenyan soil for the first time. The symbolism was rich. A nation and a family, once divided by race and ocean, were coming together. As dawn broke on Uhuru Day, Kenyatta, now affectionately called Mzee, meaning the elder, by his people, faced the joyous but daunting task of governing a new nation. In the year following independence, Kenyatta moved from being Prime Minister of a Commonwealth realm to President of the Republic of Kenya. In December 1964, Kenya became a republic and Kenyatta its executive president, combining head of state and head of government roles. He would be re-elected unopposed and rule until his death in 1978. During these 14 years, Kenyatta's leadership was marked by reconciliation and stability on one hand, and authoritarian consolidation on the other. From the start, President Kenyatta sought to reassure and include Kenya's diverse communities in nation-building. He appointed members of various ethnic groups to his cabinet, including his former rival Ojinga Odinga Aluo as vice president. European and Asian Kenyans too were given a place in the new Kenya so long as they took up citizenship. Kenyatta's government notably retained some senior white civil servants and even had white ministers like Bruce Mackenzie in charge of agriculture. This was Kenyatta's pragmatic balancing act. He preserved key elements of the colonial economic and administrative order to keep the country running smoothly. "We shall forgive and forget the injustices of the past," he urged, focusing on unity and development rather than retribution. Indeed, Kenyatta left the colonial police and military structures largely intact, valuing law, order, and continuity. At the same time, Kenyatta began centralizing power to fulfill his vision of a strong, unified state. In 1964, he persuaded the opposition party, KADU, to dissolve and join his ranks, effectively making Kenya a de facto one-party state under KANU. He tolerated little dissent. When his erstwhile ally, Vice President Odinga, grew critical and formed a new party, the Kenya People's Union, Kenyatta banned it and detained opponents without trial using new security laws. Over 1966 to 69, political rivals like Odinga were sidelined, and measures like the 1966 amendment allowed Kenyatta to order detention of anyone deemed a threat with no trial. Such moves cemented Kenyatta's control, but at the cost of democratic freedoms. By the late 1960s, a cult of personality surrounded him. Portraits of the stern, grandfatherly Kenyatta, often depicted holding his iconic fly-whisk symbol of authority, adorned shops and offices, and his image even appeared on Kenya's currency. He was celebrated as Father of the Nation, the wise Mzee who led Kenya out of bondage. Under Kenyatta's stewardship, Kenya enjoyed relative peace and economic growth in an often turbulent region. He embraced a capitalist, pro-Western development model during the Cold War, rejecting communism as firmly as he had imperialism. Western investments poured in, and Kenya's economy grew at an impressive average of over 6% annually in the 1960s and 70s, hailed as an African economic miracle by the World Bank. New schools and clinics opened, infrastructure expanded. However, the benefits of growth were far from evenly shared. Much of the newfound wealth remained concentrated among Kenyatta's inner circle and ethnic base. A policy of Africanization was instituted to transfer commerce and land from Asian and European owners to African hands. In practice, this often meant to the hands of well-connected elites. The president's own family amassed vast land holdings and business interests, sometimes through murky means. Corruption became widespread, whispered about in private, but seldom challenged openly during Kenyatta's life. One of the thorniest issues was land reform, the very issue that had catalyzed the Mau Mau War. The British had provided $27 million for Kenya to buy out settler farms and resettle African families. Kenyatta's government did facilitate the transfer of some farms to African ownership, but much of this land went to wealthy politicians and cooperative societies they controlled, rather than to the landless masses. Kenyatta himself acquired extensive property in his home district of Kiambu and elsewhere. Many ordinary Mau Mau veterans returned from the forests to find that they remained dispossessed. The land they had fought for was now owned by someone else, sometimes even by Africans from other tribes or by former loyalists who had the money to buy it. This sowed seeds of resentment that would long fester. When Mzee Jomo Kenyatta died in August 1978, thousands mourned the only leader independent Kenya had ever known. Dignitaries from around the globe attended his state funeral. In the decades since, Kenyatta has come to occupy a towering yet ambiguous place in history. Within Kenya, he is still widely revered as the nation's founding father, the man who through charisma and shrewd navigation led his people out of colonial subjugation. He fostered a sense of national identity and stability during Kenya's early fragile years. Under his rule, unlike some African countries, Kenya never descended into civil war or military coups. he preached reconciliation between races and tribes, and indeed Kenya's European minority lived on and thrived, while ethnic clashes were largely contained. For this, many remember him fondly as father of the nation, the wise patriarch who held Kenya together. Conversely, Kenyatta's critics highlight the other side of that coin. They argue that his style of governance was dictatorial and inclined toward nepotism. Detractors note that freedom of expression and political pluralism were early casualties under Kenyatta. The seeds of one-party authoritarianism were planted on his watch. They point out that while Kenyatta spoke passionately against the injustices of colonial rule, in power he presided over continuities with colonialism. A small elite, now African and often Kikuyu like himself, controlled wealth and land, while the poor black majority saw relatively little change in their economic plight. To these critics, Kenyatta's rule was neo-colonial, in that it left intact many inequities of colonial Kenya, merely swapping white rulers for black. Nowhere is this more evident than in the fate of the Mau Mau veterans. As the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission later reported, President Kenyatta used his power to allocate large tracts of former colonial land to himself and his family, while many Mau Mau fighters and their families remained dispossessed and voiceless. The sacrifice of the forest fighters was not officially honored in Kenyatta's time. In fact, public memory of Mau Mau was suppressed for over 40 years after independence. It was not until 2003 that the ban on Mau Mau was finally lifted by a later government, allowing Kenya to openly acknowledge that chapter of its history. History's verdict on Jomo Kenyatta thus remains layered with irony and nuance. Here was a man who started as a radical young firebrand, writing to the Times for land rights, yet as president accumulated vast lands for his own lineage. A leader who suffered injustice in a colonial court, yet in power was slow to reform an unjust system at home. A freedom fighter by reputation who pragmatically sidelined the very militants who fought for freedom. Kenyatta was, in many ways, a bridge between eras, able to don a Kikuyu elder's leopard skin cap in one moment and a Western business suit in another. He opened Kenya to the world and steered a careful course, but also left deep issues unresolved. Today, Kenyatta's name graces monuments, highways, even the country's largest airport. His portrait still hangs in public offices. He is remembered with a mix of awe and ambivalence, a liberator to some, a disappointment to others. Yet without question, his life's journey, from a peasant's hut to a prison cell to the presidential palace, mirrors the wider saga of Africa's 20th century quest for self-determination. Jomo Kenyatta's story is the story of Kenya, full of drama, contradiction, heartbreak and hope, in a softened tone. As we conclude, we reflect on Kenyatta's own words at independence. Let us unite, let us forgive those who trespass against us, and let us move forward. In forging a nation, Kenyatta chose unity over vengeance, a choice that brought peace, but at a cost we are still examining. His legacy invites us to ask, what is the price of peace, and whose stories get silenced in the name of moving on?